Should have started further over here. How many of there are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 of us. All right, how many of you would be willing to eat? Okay, so let me preface this. When I was raised, I was taught that when you go to somebody's house, you kind of eat what's put in front of you regardless of what it is. I've held to that for the most part. Throughout my life, even when I was in Peru, I was invited to a village leader's house for dinner one time, and as I was eating chicken and yuca stew, which is a common dish in Peru because what's for dinner every night? It's chicken and yuca in some form or another. Those are the staples in the jungle in Peru. And as I was eating the stew, I don't know, it just tasted a little odd and was kind of gritty. And I'm like, well, you know, this is what's for dinner because we didn't cook back at our hut for the night. And so I ate it, and I was still hungry. The village leader's wife asked me if I wanted seconds. I'm like, sure. I went with her to the stew pot, and as she was stirring up the stew, a couple of chicken feet appeared, and the chicken feet had not been cleaned, and they were encrusted with dirt and grit, and that was why the stew was kind of gritty and probably tasted odd. It was boiled to within an inch of its life, so I wasn't worried about getting sick. It just didn't care for it. So I've largely held to that, you know, instruction from my mother. When you're a guest in someone's house, you eat what they serve you, whether you like it or not. But there are lines. There are some things that I would not eat. So how many of you, if you went to somebody's house and they were serving a dish made of earthworms, how many of you would partake? Oh, nobody up for earthworms. Okay, how about grasshoppers? Oh, okay, fish, any fish. Sea bass, salmon, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. Okay, so that's everybody except for the one professed vegetarian in the house, who I assume is going to eat none of this. Okay, rattlesnake. 3 of you. Alligator. 2, 3, 4, 6, 6. Have any of you ever had alligator? Alligator tail? Where at?
Florida, I think.
Florida?
Yeah, Florida, fish market.
Okay, all right. Oh, at the fish market here in town, yeah. Mm-hmm. How many of you would eat bald eagle? You would?
I guess I hate America now.
In spite of the fact that it's illegal to kill or possess or anything a bald eagle, you would just flaunt federal law and you would eat it.
I might try it.
Okay, well, we know who's going to jail. Chicken. 7 out of 8 of you. Cow. 7 out of 8 of you. How many of you, if you were traveling in Indonesia and somebody had killed an orangutan and that's what was for dinner, how many of you would eat an orangutan? Jameson. Once again, in globally endangered species, you would probably go to jail. You can hang out with Aiden. Chimpanzee.
Yeah, chimps are mean, they deserve it.
Chimps are mean, they deserve it. How many of you would eat a fellow human? What if you were in a plane crash in the Andes in the 1970s and there was no hope that anybody was coming to get you at any time, and there were a bunch of people who had been killed in the plane crash, and you and your fellow soccer teammates survived, and it was either eat the dead bodies of the people who died in the plane crash or starve to death in the cold, bitter Andes mountains until someone comes around to rescue you. How do humans sound now? Oh, you would just starve to death rather than eat your fellow passengers. Okay, so reflect on what's on the board for a minute. Ask yourself, why are there low responses for some things and high responses for others? If I was in a plane crash and they were already dead, I would certainly eat my fellow humans in order to stave off starvation. And this is actually a true story. It happened back in the 70s. It's a plane crash in the Andes, and it was a soccer team and some other people. Some of the people died in the crash, other people lived, and the soccer team fed off of the remains of the people who had died in the plane crash to stave off starvation under what is dire circumstances. There's a book written about it called Alive, and then they made a movie out of it a couple of times actually. One was a kind of made-for-TV sort of movie shortly after the book came out, and then there was a relatively recent remake of it, and they were both called Alive with an exclamation point after the word alive. Why did you say no to grasshoppers and earthworms?
Because most people find insects gross.
Okay, so insects are gross. People actually eat grasshoppers. I used to teach an entomology class, and towards the end of the semester, we actually had an entomological bake-off, and crickets were on the menu. You can actually buy culinary quality crickets that are fed on good food that are intended for people cooking and eating them. They have a particular texture that one must get used to. So there's a familiarity. Things that are too unfamiliar to you, you don't want to eat because of precisely that reason. They're just too unfamiliar. They're kind of icky, and you think of them as gross. I don't know of any culture that feeds on on earthworms. But once again, when I was in Peru, there's a beetle that's a part of the palm beetle. It burrows down into the trunk of a palm tree, and at the base of the palm tree, you can chop the banana palm off. And down in there's this gigantic grub. It's like that long and that big around. And it's basically just full of sugar. And people crush them and make them into jams in Peru. That's an insect larva, but still it's an insect, and they're quite good actually. It's kind of like it's almost fig-like in terms of taste. You guys ever have fig jam? It's kind of like fig jam. So this is due to unfamiliarity. All of you have had fish at one time or another probably in your lives. So that's familiar to you. What was your those of you who didn't say you were willing to eat rattlesnake, what was your trepidation about rattlesnake? I've never had it, but I hear it tastes like chicken. Anybody want to share why they wouldn't eat rattlesnake?
I mean, I guess I'd be willing to have it if it didn't look like a rattlesnake.
It actually, I've seen it prepared. It doesn't actually end up looking like rattlesnake. It would be hard to tell what exactly it is because it just doesn't resemble any other food that you've had, but it wouldn't look like a snake. It's usually cut up in little sections.
Okay, that was my initial thought. So.
That is you don't want to be downing a long snake. I get that.
I would keep it down, that's why.
Yeah, okay. Alligator, a number of you are familiar with alligator and have actually had it before and would be willing to eat it. Aiden would be willing to eat a bald eagle simply because he is edgy and rebellious and will throw all law to the wind and say, screw federal law protecting bald eagles, I'm going to eat one. Chickens are really familiar as a food source. Cows are really familiar as a food source. But then you guys kind of shy away from orangutans and chimpanzees. I could have put African lowland gorillas on the list also. These are eaten by people in places where they occur. What's your problems with eating these animals?
Yeah. Well, we think they're intelligent, and they're nice, and they're our friends.
Except for you think chimpanzees are evil and mean, and you might as well eat them. They can be very aggressive, and they're very strong, actually. They're territorial, but we oftentimes think of them as intelligent. What else about them might make you have second thoughts about eating them? Those things are too unfamiliar. What's the problem with those other things?
It's too familiar.
Hmm?
It's too familiar.
It's too familiar, isn't it? This is way too close to looking like us and acting like us in many ways for us to be comfortable eating them, which of course is, I assume, why you also shied away from this as a food source. Too familiar. I didn't put pigs. I don't know why I didn't put pigs up there. You guys have any problems with pigs? Who would be willing to eat pigs? Yeah, my guess is most of us eat pigs. Pigs are highly intelligent, but they don't look like us. So we get to this chapter in Poland's book where he talks about the ethics of eating meat. And this bar chart of your responses to kind of what you would eat is reflected in this chapter on the ethics of eating meat. I guess it starts around page 307. Singer's argument, so talking about Peter Singer, this philosopher who is against eating meat. He wrote a book called Animal Liberation. Singer's argument is disarmingly simple in provided that you accept its premises, difficult to refute. Take the premise of equality among people, which most of us readily accept. Yet what do we really mean by it? After all, people are not, as a matter of fact, equal at all. Some are smarter than others, handsomer, more gifted, whatever. Equality is a moral idea, Singer points out, not an assertion of fact. The moral idea is that everyone's interests ought to receive equal consideration, regardless of what they are like or what abilities they have. So this is a tricky thing, and I don't know to the degree to which you guys talk about this when you talk about John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, when you're in what's that course? Responsible Self. Yeah, thank you. When we think about equality in the United States, we don't mean that everybody is created equal. I realize that is a phrase that I guess it's in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. This idea that all people are created equal, it's not to say that we all have equal abilities. I cannot run as fast as Usain Bolt. Regardless of how much I might train, I will never run as fast as Usain Bolt. He is just physiologically, morphologically more adept at sprinting than I am, or I ever will be. Usain Bolt would kick my ass every time, regardless of what I did to try and become better at running. So the idea of equality among humans, among American humans, is this idea that we have equal opportunity and that we have equal protection under the law. How do you guys feel about these two ideas in America in the year 2021? Feel like everybody in the United States has equal opportunity? Oh, before you were quiet because you didn't want to talk about science. Now you're quiet because you don't want to talk about uncomfortable topics. Equal opportunity. Yes, I just mocked you a little bit, teensy weensy bit. (2021) Equal opportunity?
I'm not from here, but I would say no.
Why?
Because I think that society still has a lot of bias. And,
I would not disagree with you there. Others? Biased against whom or towards whom?
groups of minorities, everyone that is not male, white, and of the higher class.
Well, now I'm just hurt because I'm a white male.
Okay.
I am a white male. I'm a first generation college student. So my parents didn't go to college. But I recognize the fact that many things were made easier for me simply because I'm male and I'm white. You know, that's just as far as I'm concerned, that's just a fact of life. My life was easier because I was white and because I was male. Regardless of my socioeconomic background, regardless of the educational background of my parents, et cetera, et cetera. In what other ways is there inequality of opportunity?
Money.
Oh, explain.
Well, if you're born into the world, you have more opportunities than somebody who wasn't born into the world, have to work harder for.
Okay, so having money is always useful. Money opens doors that wouldn't be open to you otherwise. Thinking about money, how does where you come from influence your socioeconomic lot in life? You guys know anything about the Liberty public school system? None of you are from Liberty, right? Yeah. Oh, you're from Liberty. Where'd you go to high school?
Liberty North.
Oh, Liberty North. That's a relatively new high school, isn't it? They just lost big time in state championship, I hear.
Yeah.
I don't follow sports, but it's hard to avoid the topic. Was it a close game?
Not really.
Not really. Oh, okay. So sometimes they're heartbreaking because they're so close and you just missed it. Sometimes they're heartbreaking because you got your butt kicked.
Yeah.
Is the second one?
What?
Was it the second one?
Yes, it was the second one.
Okay, all right. What kind of facilities did you have there at Liberty North?
Very nice facilities, I would say.
Very nice facilities. Where did those facilities come from?
Taxpayers,
Taxpayers. Any particular type of taxpayers?
homeowners,
Homeowners, because a lot of education funding comes from what we call property taxes. If you own a home, if you own a car, if you own a camper, if you own a boat, you pay property taxes on those, and when you look at your breakdown, it breaks down what amount of your tax bill goes to what things, and a surprisingly big portion of your property taxes go to supporting local educational systems. What are property values here in the Liberty area? Are they high? Are they low relative to other places?
Higher.
Yeah, I bought my house. My house that I bought, that I live in, that you saw pictures of the other week, I paid $102,000 for it in 2004. Do you know what its current assessment is? Especially in today's housing market. Last time I looked, which was a couple of weeks ago, I don't know why I keep track of what my house would sell for if I decided to sell.
What you originally bought it for right now.
Not quite double, but it's like 136,000. And I owe like, I don't know, $64,000 on it. If I sold it, woo, I'd be making buck. We have high property taxes in Liberty, so when you go to, we have high property value, so when you go to pay your property taxes, you're paying relatively high property taxes, which means that provides a lot of revenue for education, public education in the Liberty area. If you go to other parts of the Kansas City Metroplex, are you going to find the same property values that you find here? No, you will not. In places they are much lower than here. So schools in those parts of town, guess what they have? Fewer revenues from property taxes. As a result, they have less money for public education. So where you live has a big influence on the quality of education that you might get, because it affects the facilities that you go to school in, it affects the pay that you can offer teachers to come and teach in that school system, et cetera, et cetera. So simply, in some cases, by nature of where you were born and where you grew up, you had unequal opportunity to quality education because our educational system is based on a tax system that is based on the value of property. You can think about it yourself and see if you find that to be problematic or not. But what it certainly does do is it sets up inequalities at the very foundations of a person's development in terms of their early education. Equal protection. Equal protection under law. This is promised to us in the Constitution. Actually, it's the clause of the Constitution called the Equal Protection Clause. Reads something along the lines of all people shall have equal protection under the law. Julia, you are tight-lipped.
I don't think that's what happened.
You don't think that's what happens. Why do you not think that's what happens?
Bias again.
Okay, so bias. Why are systems biased? Why are educational systems biased? Why are judicial systems biased? Somebody other than Julia. Yeah.
Because individual people have biases and individual people make up systems.
All of these systems are based in humanity, and human beings are inherently biased. You can go to Harvard, you can log on to a website at Harvard called, what the heck is it called? They have an implicit bias test. You can take an implicit bias test at Harvard, and you can actually see how biased you actually are. It will actually give you a numerical score for your level of bias. I've taken it before. Everybody should at some point, because we all have biases. To say that you're not unbiased is to say that you don't see color. Like, we all see color. We just refuse to acknowledge that we see color. It's an old joke on the Stephen Colbert show that he doesn't have any black friends because he doesn't see color. It's ludicrous, which is why he made a joke out of it. Any human system is prone to biases because it is a system created by humans, and humans are inherently biased. Have any of you guys ever served on jury duty? I got called for jury duty once. You show up at the courthouse, you sit with a pool of prospective jurors, and they go through voir dire, where the lawyers from each side ask you questions in order to ascertain whether or not they want you to be in the jury pool. I came to find out after the fact that the case that I was being called in was a civil medical malpractice suit. Somebody was suing their doctor for malpractice in search of a cash settlement or cash award by the court. And there were lawyers there representing the doctor, and there were lawyers there representing the supposedly aggrieved party. And they went around to each of the jurors, and when they got to me, they asked where I worked. And I told them William Jewell College. They asked me what I taught. I said I teach biology. Oh, what kind of biology do you teach? Oh, well, I'm formally trained as an ecologist, but I've taught genetics, I've taught anatomy and physiology in the past, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as I said that I had taught anatomy and physiology, I could see the looks on both teams of lawyers. They wanted no part of me. They wanted nothing to do with a PhD trained person who knows about the topic that they're about to have a trial about. You know why? Aiden.
Because they're fast and loose with their evidence and well.
Yeah, they don't want somebody who knows anything on that jury. They want people on that jury who will listen to them and take what they say as the gospel truth. As soon as I saw the looks on their faces, I didn't know why at the time, because I didn't know what the case was at the time. As soon as they saw me, I saw their faces, and they're like, neither of us want this guy. And so the question then became of the lawyers, which team was going to actually strike me? Which is weird, because if I'm ever called if I'm ever accused of a crime, you know what I want? I want the smartest people on the jury that I can possibly get. Because I think that being on a jury is something that should be really important. And you should have critically thinking people sitting on juries, because lawyers have an agenda. The agenda for the doctor's lawyer in this case was to get that doctor off and not have to pay any damages. The agenda of the lawyer on the other side was to get damages from the doctor and the doctor's insurance company. It's an adversarial court system that we have. Both of those sides have an agenda. The only possible people who might not have an agenda in the courtroom are maybe the judge, maybe not the judge, but certainly possibly the jurors, because the jurors in a sense don't have anything to lose or gain based on the outcome of the process. Now, it doesn't mean that jurors can't still be biased, but certainly they don't have any skin in the game. If I'm ever accused of a crime, I want a jury of my peers. I want a bunch of PhD level people sitting there thinking critically about what my lawyer and the other lawyer is saying. I do not want whatever they got in that trial. As a result, I went home at noon because I was dismissed. We have bias systems because human beings are biased. In the case of these lawyers, they were biased against knowledge. They did not want anybody in that jury pool who had any sort of external knowledge to bring to bear on what was said. So this idea of equality that Singer talks about, equality is a moral idea. It's an idea, it's not an assertion of fact. The moral idea is that everyone's interests ought to receive equal consideration, regardless of what they are like or what abilities they have. Many philosophers have gone this far, but few have taken the next logical step. If possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans for the same purpose? This is the nub of Singer's argument. And right away here on page 6, I'm scribbling objections in the margin. But humans differ from animals in morally significant ways. Yes, they do, Singer readily acknowledges, which is why we shouldn't treat pigs and children alike. Equal consideration of interest is not the same as equal treatment. Children have an interest in being educated, pigs in rooting around in the dirt, but when their interests are the same, the principle of equality demands they receive the same consideration, and the one all-important interest humans share with pigs, as with all sentient creatures, is an interest in avoiding pain. Here Singer quotes a famous passage from Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century utilitarian philosopher. The day may come, Bentham wrote, when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights. Way he was talking about the freeing of slaves. So I'll just read the whole thing. The 18th century utilitarian philosopher Bentham is writing in 1789 after the French had freed their black slaves and granted them fundamental rights, but before the British or Americans had acted. The day may come, Bentham wrote, when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights. Bentham then asked what characteristics entitle any being to moral consideration. Is it the faculty of reason or perhaps the faculty of discourse, Bentham asks. But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversational animal than an infant. The question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Bentham here is playing a powerful card philosophers call the argument for marginal cases. It goes like this: there are humans, infants, the severely retarded, the demented, whose mental function does not rise to the level of a chimpanzee. Even though these people cannot reciprocate our moral attentions, obey the golden rule, etc., we nevertheless include them in the circle of our moral consideration. So on what basis do we exclude chimpanzees? Because he's a chimp, I furiously scribble in the margin, and they're human. Oh, because he's a chimp and they're human beings. So this distinction between would you eat a chimp versus would you eat a human being. For Singer, that's not good enough. To exclude the chimp from moral consideration simply because he's not human is no different than excluding the slave simply because he's not white. In the same way we call that exclusion racist, the animal rightist contends it's speciesist to discriminate against the chimpanzee solely because he is not human. But the differences between blacks and whites are trivial compared to the differences between my son and a chimp, Poland writes in his book. Singer asks us to imagine a hypothetical society that discriminates on the basis of something non-trivial, intelligence, say. If that scheme offends our sense of equality, as it surely does, then why is the fact that an animal lacks this or that human characteristic any more just a basis for discrimination? Either we do not owe any justice to the severely retarded, he concludes, or we do owe it to animals with higher capabilities. So Singer is building this argument that we shouldn't discriminate against other species because discriminating against other species by killing them and eating them and raising them in concentrated animal feeding operations and ultimately butchering them and consuming them is no different than it's the moral equivalent of how we treated slaves at one point. We had white people and slaves in two different categories, and because they were different, we could treat slaves however we wanted to without any sort of moral complications. Singer is arguing that that is the same treatment that we exert towards cows and pigs, etc., because they are different, and as a result, they are subject to a different set of moral consideration. So that is the argument, that's the fundamental argument that Singer is working on, because he wants to get you to this idea that equivalency isn't what we should be basing our decisions on. There's a simpler, more salient issue that we should be talking about, but before we move on to that, I want you guys to discuss for a few minutes this moral equivalency argument. Is likeness sufficient to warrant or have no warrant of moral consideration? Do you have to treat people all the same because they're similar enough to us, or if people are different enough from us, does that justify treating them differently?
I don't know, I personally feel like there's enough difference between people and like actual animals to make that difference in treatment, but I could be wrong.
So Singer would say, okay, so what degree of similarity do you have to cross before you cross from doesn't need moral consideration to needs moral consideration? Like how similar is similar? I mean, based on this, the similarity line gets crossed someplace between a cow and an orangutan. Who said yes to the orangutan?
That was me.
That was you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree that there should be some level of like acknowledgement given to, they shouldn't just be treated like corn or soybeans or some crop of some kind.
Plants are super safe because plants are in so many ways not like us.
Right. But so I feel like there should be some acknowledgement made and some sort of respect given for animals in that sense, but I don't really see the argument of putting them on the same plane as like you and I type thing.
Okay, so what separates a chimpanzee from a human? Let's explore this for a little while. Probably about 15 years ago, there was a philosopher who came to speak at William Jewell College. And this philosopher had written a book, and I was asked to serve on a panel, which is really unusual for scientists to do, especially when that philosopher was invited for the Benz Lecture. Do you guys know what the Benz Lecture is here at William Jewell College? I don't know if they hold it anymore. The Benz Lecture was a lecture that was kind of aligned with the sacred and secular section of the critical thought and inquiry program. And I was asked to be on the panel, and because I was unfamiliar with how panels in this framework worked, I asked, what do I have to do? And they were like, well, you write a short paper, you make a short opening statement, and then after all the panelists have made their statement, then there's a discussion among the panelists, a discussion with the members of the audience, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, okay, so what exactly is the topic? And the topic was about this equivalency, this equality of moral consideration. And so I'm like, okay, so I read this person's book. I kind of knew what they were going to say. And so I went to the literature on chimpanzees, chimpanzee behavior. I teach a course in animal behavior. As a result of that, I had dabbled in chimpanzee behavior somewhat, but in preparation for this panel, I took a deep dive into what is known about chimpanzee behavior. And so what do you guys consider to be the fundamental differences between chimpanzees and humans? What does one group have that the other group doesn't? In your mind, in your experience. I don't expect you to be experts on chimpanzee behavior, but you're certainly experts on humans. Yeah.
Human vocalizations.
So language. Do chimpanzees have language?
Primitive one.
Hmm?
Primitive one.
Primitive language. If you were in a science class, I would ask you to define primitive, but I'll leave it for now. What other differences do we have? Do you perceive we have?
Humans think about thinking.
Metacognition. Metacognition is just the fancy pants term for thinking about thinking. Are you thinking about thinking, or are you also thinking about abstractions? Or are those two different skills in your mind?
I guess they could be different, but I think we do both.
So what I mean when I say thinking abstractly, I mean thinking about something that's not there, that's not readily apparent to you. For example, for a long time, humans did not have a concept of zero. Were you guys aware of this? On our bar chart earlier with all the species there, I started it at 1. But the fact that starting with 1 implies that, of course, when none of you were willing to eat earthworms or grasshoppers, that implied that down here someplace was a 0. I didn't write it. I didn't write it on purpose. I just kind of didn't write it down because I don't know why I didn't write it down. But for a long period of human history, we had no concept of 0. Because it's difficult for humans to think of nothing. And while we might have thought of having no grain in our grain bag or no seeds in our seed bag, no food stored up for the next year, we didn't have the ability for a long time of putting that into a numerical form, even though we could count how many grains of seed we had, how many cows we had in our herd, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of when we had no more cows left, that would actually also have a numerical equivalent. It's weird to think about, but whole books have been written about the origin derivation of the concept of 0, which is weird. Thinking abstractly, thinking about things that you can't see, that you only have to imagine. What other differences? I assume that you're saying that chimps can't do either of these.
Not to my knowledge, but I don't know.
What else? Humans use tools. Do chimps use tools? Chimps do use tools. So They make tools, they're primitive tools, but they do make tools and they use tools. Any other characteristics you want to think about separation between chimps and humans?
I don't know where chimps are on it, but we can form relationships.
Oh, chimps can definitely form relationships. They have a social hierarchy. So chimpanzees will actually form coalitions. So chimps, when you have male chimps coming up in a troop of chimps, there comes a point where they get old enough and big enough that they can challenge the troop leader for the leadership position, and oftentimes they fail at that, and the leader will eject those chimps from the troop, and they become these kind of wandering males. If the group of wandering males gets booted out of a troop, they will form a coalition, and they will go into another troop, and they will try and work together to depose the leader of that troop. And if they do, they kick that individual out. And then now you have these 3 or 4 related brothers who are now in charge of this troop, and inevitably there's a contest within the 3 of them as to which one is going to come to control that troop. And then the other 2 chimps, the other 2 brothers, if there's a group of 3 of them, have to either kind of take subordinate roles, or they eventually get booted out of that troop as well. So there are all sorts of, there's a social hierarchy within chimp social structure. Now, if you say forming relationships, you mean falling in love, I don't know what that would mean for a chimp, because I'm not quite sure that I know what that means for humans, actually. But they do have these social interactions that are similar to the kinds of social interactions that human beings have. What else? Oftentimes, the things that people say separate chimps from humans is language, tool use, and complex thinking. So you guys got, in among the things that you mentioned were these fundamental differences that separate chimps from humans. So now I'm going to tell you a story about a group of chimps in Gombe forest in Africa. Gombe is a place where people study chimps for decades, and one day these researchers were watching this one troop of chimps, and these chimps seemingly responding to no cue that the researchers could clue in on. All of a sudden, these chimps kind of gathered together in a group in the center of the place where they hung out, in the area where they sleep and eat and everything. And they kind of huddled up in a group for a little while, and then after a little while they dispersed, and some of the troops stayed there, and other members of the troop disappeared into the forest. And then sometime later, the chimps that were there at the home area got up en masse and started hauling ass through the forest. And the researchers took off after the chimps because it was their job to follow the activities of the chimps. And they saw that the chimps got off of the ground where they normally are and got up into the trees and start basically hauling ass through the treetops. And after a little while, and they were making a terrible racket, a huge amount of noise, and before long, the researchers realized that the chimps were chasing a group of colobus monkeys. So there were colobus monkeys. These are monkeys with long hair. They're black and white, have a really long, fluffy tail. They were chasing these colobus monkeys through the treetops, and they were making a ton of noise, and the colobus monkeys were hauling ass away from the band of chimps that were chasing them. And they chased the colobus monkeys through the treetops for a while, and after a certain period of time, those colobus monkeys ran into a group of chimps who were hiding in the trees, waiting for the first chimps to chase the colobus monkeys to them. They caught them, they killed them, they ate them. It's the first instance recording chimps eating other primates, and it was also the first instance of what was apparently language effective enough to sit around in a group and hatch a plan, and abstract thinking enough to know that there were a group of colobus monkeys that probably had been reported by one of the chimps that had been wandering around in the forest, and abstract thinking enough to know that if we send part of our group to a position in the forest, the rest of us chase those colobus monkeys towards the others, then it will be easy to catch them because the colobus monkeys will be paying attention to the chasers, not paying attention to the waiters, and they will catch them, easily kill them, and eat them. How do you feel about chimpanzees now? They can think abstractly, they can communicate with one another well enough to hatch plans. They use tools. I would argue chimps are way more like us than they are differ from us. So, this is the difficulty with the similarity idea. Because oftentimes the more we learn about something, we see that a lot of the differences that we thought that two groups used to have are actually differences that we recognize simply because we're ignorant of that group, whatever that group happens to be. In this case, the group is just chimpanzees. Many of the barriers that we have placed up in the past that kind of separate us from our other primate relatives basically have evaporated as primatologists have learned more and more about the social behavior of these other primates. Ruth, do you have a comment? You look like you had a comment.
Mm-hmm.
No? Okay. So Singer argues that this moral equivalency on the basis of similarity is a bad way to go about doing things, because we come into this question of how dissimilar do two groups have to be before one group affords moral consideration to the other group. At one time, it was white people and black people. At a later time, it was all people and chimpanzees and orangutans. Now, we don't even do testing, animal testing and things like this on chimpanzees and other primates anymore, simply because we discovered that other animal models give us the same answers. They're just as reliable as doing animal testing on chimpanzees. And so we don't really need to do that anymore. And we've come to that conclusion largely because we did research on rats and chimpanzees and things like this, partly in order to determine if we really needed to do research on chimpanzees anymore. It used to be thought that chimpanzees were close enough to us that the only way we can know, for example, how a drug would behave is if we injected it into a chimp. Well, it turns out injecting it into a rat is just as effective. And so we don't do that anymore, largely because we have extended this moral consideration to other primate species. That caused difficulties because we have all these chimps sitting around in research labs. They're very long-lived. Now we're not doing research on them, and so what do we do with them? And so there's a series of sanctuaries around the country where chimps that used to be used in medical research have gone to live out their lives. You can't release them back to the wild because they've been in captivity for so long. And so they live in these facilities where they basically are kept until they die of natural causes. So our view of moral equivalency, moral consideration, changes over time. As we learn more, as we hopefully become better human beings in a sense. So if this is a terrible way of doing things, figuring out what things are similar to us or dissimilar enough to us that we either provide them moral equivalent consideration or not, what does Singer say we should use as our criterion?
You said what's a Singer thing?
What does Singer think we should use as our criterion for whether or not we should account for moral consideration for an organism not like us?
Ability to suffer.
The ability to suffer. It's like, it's pretty simple. If it's capable of suffering, you shouldn't kill and eat it. Plants are good, because as far as we know, plants don't suffer. One of the base physiological criteria that you can ask yourself if an animal is capable of suffering is just ask if it has a developed nervous system. If it has a developed nervous system, it can feel pain. If it can feel pain, then obviously it's capable of suffering. This would rule out any organism, according to Singer, that essentially has nerves and a central processing nervous system for processing those nerve impulses, which would include everybody in the animal kingdom. Grasshoppers would be safe, earthworms would be safe, lobsters, mollusks, all of those things. But so would cows and chickens and fish and all those other things that we eat on a regular basis. This brings me back to pokey feeders. Do you think those animals at pokey feeders are suffering? Aiden?
At the very least, one can assume they're not happy.
So he gets to happiness at the end of this chapter, doesn't he? I don't know how to assess whether an animal is happy or not. I like to think I can in some cases. I'm building a teardrop camper in my spare time, simply because I want to go camping and I'm tired of camping in a tent. Because last time I went camping in a tent, the tent leaked and it was kind of miserable for the time that I was out camping. I want to enjoy myself while I'm camping. I'm building this camper at my wife's parents' barn up in Smithville because it has enough space that I can just kind of spread out, take up a bunch of space and build this camper in their barn. They have cats, they have barn cats, they have garage cats, they have a lot of cats. The daughter constantly, Elizabeth's sister is constantly bringing cats home and they end up residing at the house. And there's a barn cat there named Penelope. She's lived in the barn her entire life, and I'm the only one who spends a significant amount of time in the barn because I'm building a teardrop camper there. The other people that come out, they feed the horses, they tend to the chickens, and then they go back to the house. So me and Penelope are the only two kind of long-term permanent barn residents, and Penelope loves me. I go out there to work, she hops up on the camper, she's constantly pawing at me, she rubs her forehead against my forehead. She'll jump onto the table saw, which is not so good because she wants to be cuddled because nobody ever comes out and cuddles Penelope. I go back and forth, the trailer's on one end of the barn, the saw's on the other end of the barn, and I'll saw things in one area and then put them in the trailer on the other area. And even if I'm just going to the other end of the barn for a few minutes, she will follow me to the other end of the barn, and when I go back to the trailer, she'll follow me back to the trailer, et cetera, et cetera. I am pretty sure that when I'm at the barn, Penelope is happy. But I don't know if she's happy. She acts like she wants to see me when I arrive because she runs out of the barn to greet me at the car, knowing full well that as soon as I get out of the car, I'm walking right into the barn. I'm pretty sure that Penelope is happy, but I don't know that Penelope is happy. What does Salatin claim about his animals on his farm, on Polyface Farm? Joel Salatin. Somebody other than Aiden. I'm so tired of hearing from Aiden today. Cameron? Do you remember what Joel Salatin says about his animals?
never talks about them being the workers on the farm, but
He talks about them being the workers on the farm. He talks about raising them in ways that allow chickens to be chickens and cows to be cows. What does he think this does to his animals?
allows them to live as they would had they not been on his farm.
Allows them to live how they would if they were not on the farm. He thinks this makes his animals happy during the time that they're being raised to ultimately be slaughtered and fed to people. But he doesn't know that they're happy. So happy is beyond just not suffering. If you lived in my little house with 17 other people with no plumbing, I would not be happy. Would I be suffering? I would argue I would be suffering. I would probably be way more prone to getting disease. I would certainly be crankier than I currently am, and I'm probably cranky enough. I might even kill one or two of those fellow housemates simply because put animals in a crowded situation like that, they get aggressive sometimes. Happens with rats in labs when rats are overcrowded. Yeah, I would think I would be suffering if there were 17 other people living in my house and there was no plumbing and somebody came in once a week to get rid of the feces and the urine. I surely would not be happy. But I'm also pretty sure I'd probably be suffering in some pretty fundamental ways. This is the criterion that Singer puts forth as to why we should, how we should make decisions about whether it's ethical to kill and eat an animal. Does it have the capacity to suffer? Even if you raise the animals like Joel Salatin is raising his animals on his farm, they are not suffering during their raising, but one could argue, and Singer would certainly argue this, they certainly suffer at the moment of their death, even if it's done very quickly. I'm not telling you whether you should eat meat or not. I will tell you I eat meat on a regular basis. All I'm saying is that this is one philosopher's view on the ethics of eating meat, and part of what this class should do for you, as all your critical thought and inquiry classes should do for you, is it should give you the equipment to think about these things in sensible sorts of ways, so that if you do decide to eat meat, you can say, okay, I'm deciding to eat meat because I either don't adhere to Singer's argument, or I understand the logic of Singer's argument, and I just don't think that it's an important enough argument for me to alter my behavior for. And those are both appropriate responses. I mentioned before that whenever I meet a vegetarian, I always ask them what type of vegetarian they are, because people have all kinds of reasons for being vegetarian. Peter Singer is a vegan because he's an animal rights vegan. He considers to eat any meat or any products of animals held in captivity to cause suffering to those animals, and so he's just not going to do it. You don't have to be Peter Singer, but you should think about what you eat and why you eat it. One of my hopes for this class is that you think more deeply about the food that you're eating than you did when you walked in here. I don't know the degree to which that has happened or not, but at least hopefully you're getting exposed to some tools to do that same thing. This conversation about the ethics of eating meat that appears in the third portion of the book kind of reflects back on a section earlier in the book, in the section on Joel Salatin's farm. It's a chapter that we skipped. It's chapter 9 on Big Organic. In the chapter on Big Organic, Poland talks about Rosie the Petaluma free-range chicken, organic free-range chicken. That chapter is about the organic system and how we decide what food is organic and what food is not organic. So for Wednesday, if you could read chapter 9, because we'll pick up there. We'll pay a lot of attention to Rosie the organic free-range chicken. Also for Wednesday, I want you to go to the USDA site on organic certification, and I want you to inform yourself on what it means to have an organic product in the United States in the year 2021. There are organic standards for both vegetable crops, plant crops, and there are organic standards for animals. You should familiarize yourself with both. We'll go through them in class on Wednesday, but if you have some knowledge walking into class, it will go smoother as we have that discussion. As you read chapter 9, think about what Poland talked about in the chapter on the ethics of eating meat and apply that to Rosie, the organic free range Petaluma poultry chicken. Questions? All right, you should have papers on the genetically engineered food project. Our goal for the rest of the semester is this week we're going to finish up talking about organic food. Next week we're going to talk about food deserts in the Kansas City area. So that will be something that we'll probably get to on Monday, and we'll spend next week talking about that. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, sure. You don't have to. That's fine. All right. So that's what we're looking forward to. So organic food, and then food deserts, and then that's the semester.